Representative Brett Guthrie. And Guthrie's from Kentucky, and he has introduced this legislation that would rescind the health order that came out of the Biden, actually came out of the Trump administration, declaring a COVID emergency back in 2020. The order would be ended upon passage of the legislation when it became law enacted, which means not until President Biden actually signs it. However, this is an important piece of legislation to send a clear statement to Biden that there is a need to end the pandemic, the health pandemic. The legislation itself is relatively easy. Here it is. It's bill number 382, HR 382, again by Brett Guthrie. And essentially, it's one paragraph. I'll just read it. The public health emergency declared by the Secretary pursuant to Section 319 of the Public Health Service Act on January 31, 2020, entitled the, quote, determination that a public health emergency exists nationwide as a result of the 2019 novel coronavirus, end quote, and any renewal thereof shall terminate on the date of the enactment of this act. So it's very straightforward. It's just nothing fancy. This is a single subject bill, one page. Everybody gets it. The pandemic is over, and Congress is voting to make that very clear. And so that's going to happen in the House. And a similar piece of legislation on the national emergency, not the health emergency, but on the national emergency, is anticipated to be voted on later this week. That legislation by Representative Paul Gosar deals with the overall national emergency. And the reason it's important, the health emergency creates certain powers. The national emergency creates other powers. Joe Biden is clearly confused about the whole thing because today he told the press, he's keeping the emergency COVID powers until May to get everything done. I wonder what he needs to get done under emergency powers that he couldn't do under normal things when there's no emergency anymore. Well, that's the big problem with emergency powers. So when you give emergency powers to an individual, it becomes very, very difficult for that individual to say, oh, I don't need the emergency powers. Give me less power. Well, Joe Biden is now saying he's not going to get rid of his emergency powers until May to get everything done. He did not clarify what everything done means, but one of the things that's happening right now in February is there's a Supreme Court case that will be hearing whether or not the giveaway on the student loans was legal or not, whether Joe Biden had the power to do it or not. And the Supreme Court is hearing that in February, and they're expected to provide an answer to that question in June, or well, it could be May or all the way to June 30th when they release their decisions. So so maybe he's going to wait until after that decision. We don't know. What we do know is Joe Biden, hold on to your hats, because Joe Biden refuses to get rid of the power, even though he acknowledges that the pandemic is over. So Congress is ratcheting up the pressure this week. It's hoped that the House will pass the Pandemic is Over Act today. They'll also hopefully pass HJR 7 by Paul Gosar this week, which ends the national emergency. Same exact bill passed the Senate last year, by the way, with broad bipartisan support. And Nancy Pelosi prevented it from passing the House by essentially blocking it from ever coming to the floor. So that's those two things are going to be happening this week. A third thing that's happening this week is there's a bill by House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer, which is called, it's Show Up for Work Act or something like that. It's HR 139. This bill basically says upon signature, once it goes into effect, federal workers have to be back in their offices within 30 days. And if you were working from home before the pandemic, you still get to work from home. But if you weren't working from home before the pandemic, you have to come into the office. And there's been a real problem in Washington, D.C. Believe it or not, the federal workforce still isn't in the offices. There are big giant office buildings in DC with all the federal workers are supposed to be. And they've been empty, and they've been empty for 3 years, and well, almost 3 years. And so what are we looking at? We're looking at empty office buildings. We're looking at people not showing up to work. We know that a study out of Health and Human Services in December of 2020, at the end of the Trump administration, showed that 25% of the Health and Human Services workers did not log into their computer one time, not one time in that 10 months period. There was an amendment offered to that ALG played a big role in. And unfortunately, Rules Committee did not allow the amendment to be offered on the floor. But we do anticipate having that as a standalone bill. The amendment was offered by Representative Lauren Boebert, and she will be, and it's anticipated she'll be introducing that as legislation, and we will be pressing hard to get accountability, to find out how many of these federal employees never logged in during the last 3 years. What is the percentage? How many people just didn't work? Now we're not focusing on maintenance staff, because maintenance staff wouldn't have had a reason to log in per se, but they would have had a clock in. And so we're looking for that on a clock in basis. But by and large, the federal government, with a couple of strokes of a keyboard, can tell you what percentage of the people who are paid by U.S. taxpayers to do work never once showed up to work. How many showed up once a month? How many showed up every single day? Those are the kind of things we need to know, because Joe Biden is focused on trying to create a massive work from home plan where 15 to 20% of the federal workforce works from home. That might make sense. That's something to be determined. But what we do know is if 25% of the people weren't working for 10 months at all, then we have a darn big problem. And what we're hearing from a lot of different people is that we have the backlogs for government services, such as at the IRS, for instance, actually going through tax returns and responding to questions from taxpayers, that those have slowed to a crawl. There are rumors that, not rumors, there are reports that people who are dependent upon government for services and want to be trying to get a hold of the government relating to Medicare or any other thing where it takes people actually working with clients, with taxpayers who are utilizing those programs. Getting through is extraordinarily difficult, and having consistent enforcement of the law is very, very dubious, because quite honestly, people aren't showing up. So that's a question that we're going to try to resolve. How many people are not showing up? Because once we find out that information, it's a lot easier to make proposals on what to do about it. So that's what we're dealing with this week. We're dealing with getting the government the employees to show up to work. We're dealing with ending the national emergency, the broad national emergency for COVID, and we're dealing with the narrower health emergency that Joe Biden has said that he will end in May, and Congress is acting on today to pass through the House legislation that will compel that be ended. That's what we have for you today, folks. Take care, and we will be back with you tomorrow.